My name's Mike McGonigal, and we're here for another episode of Matt Chat, and I have my guest here with me, fourth degree brown belt, Michael Brown. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, sir.
Well, thanks much. My name is Michael Brown. I'm been into jiu-jitsu for quite a long time, and been into martial arts for a number of years. Pretty much since I was a kid, and got interested in jiu-jitsu when I was in college.
Awesome, awesome. Now you're a police officer. What led you in that direction? Was it something you knew you wanted to do, or is it something you changed your mind halfway through?
Yeah, I think all throughout my life I'd known I wanted to be a police officer.
Really?
Probably from when I was about 5 or 6 years old.
Okay.
That had been something that I wanted to do, and the hard part was trying to convince my family that it was a good idea.
I can imagine.
Because there was no one else in my family that was a police officer. No one else had a background remotely like that, and so it was very, very different for me compared to the rest of my family.
Man. So when you made that decision, I'm assuming when you went to college, that was all planned out.
I did. I did not take any criminal justice type of classes in college. I did no preparation to be a law enforcement officer educationally in college. I went to college. I was playing football. I went to Cornell University, and I was a football player and enjoyed myself a great deal doing that. And I actually studied human resources in the hotel school there. So the idea that I had was that if for some reason law enforcement didn't work out, I wanted to work in the labor relations field.
Okay.
Working for a union or something along that line.
Awesome, awesome. So we've had many talks before about a need for more training. And so let's hear your views on that, because if anybody's qualified to talk about martial arts training, it's you.
Well, it's a somewhat difficult topic because it's what police do isn't really what most of us refer to as martial arts. There's really no good individual martial art developed for police officers. Now, there are aspects of martial arts that are appropriate for law enforcement. But there's nothing that's really geared around the idea of this martial art is designed for the police. There are some other countries have some martial arts, like in Japan, they do the Japanese police use a system called Daiho Jitsu, which is a police-based martial art. But even that is somewhat inappropriate for modern policing. It's not the same sort of thing that we tend to think of as martial arts, and so a lot of what you see in law enforcement winds up being, either an adapted system from somewhere else, some sort of amalgam of systems, and I taught at the police academy in Tulsa for a number of years, in several different topics. I taught defensive tactics, I taught firearms and use of force, and the system that we eventually came to was very much a blend of many different martial arts, but most importantly, it was very context based. And the context is what makes martial arts appropriate or inappropriate for any given circumstance. In other words, it's very effective to poke someone in the eyes, but it's generally pretty inappropriate for a police officer in the vast majority of use of force cases. Just like it would be inappropriate to try to, it's very appropriate, it's very effective to like I said, to gouge someone. But is it appropriate? And that's always the question in any type of police use of force, is not really just is the technique effective, but is it appropriate?
Like a lot of the defensive tactics, I would feel too military, too hardcore in a lot of situations.
It just depends,
There's a lot of
because
depends here.
because a lot of the police training tends to focus on a lot of arrest situations as opposed to combative situations.
Yes, sir.
Situations where the goal isn't to necessarily incapacitate, but rather to control somebody. Now, that said, there are times in use of force where the necessity in taking someone into custody involves incapacitation of some sort. It's not that those two are mutually exclusive. It's that it just has to be appropriate for the situation at hand. All police use of force is judged under a standard developed in a Supreme Court case called Graham versus Connor. And that determines the reasonableness of use of force under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The idea is that the reasonableness of a use of force is judged, based on a reasonable officer on the scene making a decision as a situation is occurring. So much of what we regard as as, like I said, as martial arts, like I said, may or may not meet that standard depending on the set of circumstances an officer is confronted with.
I also, we have all these videos and social media. Some people, man, you know what's going on. It's
Oh, yeah.
crazy. People are arguing and fighting. There's these lines being drawn. But just like when we first start training martial arts and we start going to the fights and we start looking at the fights with the martial artist's eyes, but we're hearing the crowd behind us, we realize that not everybody knows what they're seeing.
Right. Everybody can understand a war.
Right.
But not everybody understands the sophistication that goes into, such an event like that.
And that's something I try to explain to some of my friends that are adopting an anti-cop stance because of a lot of these videos. And I was like, you don't really know or have the story before or after. Sometimes these videos are shot, boom, you didn't see what happened before, you don't know what happened after. But when you see the actual physical thing happening, you don't know what you're seeing. Just like you don't know what you're seeing when you're watching a jiu-jitsu match. And I watch it, and sometimes I'll go back and see something else the second time because I'm not a cop. I'm not always in those situations, and I'm just using jiu-jitsu and frazzled white belts as an example.
Well, and most importantly, in that same scenario, police don't always see what's going on at the very time, which is why the issue of when I brought up the issue of Graham versus Connor is very, very important. Are you familiar with the circumstances of that particular court case?
I am with some. I think you should lay them out because of the audience.
Sure. It's basically what occurred is that Mr. Graham was a law-abiding citizen, or otherwise appearing law-abiding citizen, who was also diabetic. At some point, he felt an insulin shock coming on, and asked a friend of his to take him to the store to purchase some orange juice to try to get his insulin under control. And so his friend says, sure, takes him in the car, and they go to the first convenience store. He gets in there and realizes, oh, wait, there's so many people in line. I'm not going to get this orange juice in time. I got to go to another store. So he goes in, sprints out to the car out of a convenience store, hops in in another car, and starts saying, go, go. Well, unfortunately, a police officer, Connor, is parked across the street and sees the subject run out of a convenience store into a car and says, go. Well, I think any reasonable police officer on the scene would think that there was a very real possibility that they had just witnessed a robbery. So the officer goes in and pulls behind the vehicle. Person stops. The officer realizes, okay, if this is a robbery, it is not safe for me to just simply walk up to the car as if I was dealing with somebody that that I write a ticket to.
Yes. Because he has what would be the probable cause or probable reason?
Well, it's actually called reasonable suspicion.
Reasonable suspicion.
Rather than probable
what he
cause.
saw,
Right.
And this could be a dangerous situation.
Right. So he sees what he perceives as a possible armed robbery, decides not to approach the car because he believes there's a possibility that that a crime's afoot. The driver in the vehicle opens the door and starts yelling, as he testifies later, he's trying to tell him that my passenger's diabetic, he's got to get some orange juice. The officer really can't I guess, can't really understand what he's saying. And even if he could, if you just think you may have witnessed a robbery, it would be reasonable to assume that you can't just take someone saying that at face value. So the officer waits until some additional officers get there. But during this time, Graham has gone into diabetic shock and is losing, starting to lose consciousness, is starting to get turned to kind of hallucinate a little bit. He gets out of the car and starts running around the car.
I've been witness to this. I've had friends
in shock. The officer doesn't know what he's seeing. He just knows that he sees what looked like at one point a potential armed robbery. Eventually sees this guy running around the car, not knowing what's going on, and so now he's even more confused as to what he's witnessing.
Yes.
So eventually, Graham runs around the car a couple of times, and passes out, falls down.
Okay.
Officers eventually get there. They secure both of them in handcuffs, and eventually someone gets him some orange juice, and everything's okay. But in the process of this, Graham has been injured, falling down. He's been handcuffed, while he's having this kind of, diabetic episode. So very, very, very unfortunate set of circumstances. He hasn't committed a crime. But based upon the set of circumstances that the officers were faced with, they were, necessarily forced to be cautious in this type of scenario and treat this as, essentially the worst case scenario before they could figure out that it wasn't. So
you don't know what you don't know.
Right. You have no idea what's going on. So eventually this case goes to court and eventually winds up in the halls of the U.S. Supreme Court. And they make a decision that says, some of the language that they use in the case is that officers are forced to make split-second decisions under circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. So, in order to determine what an appropriate level of force is, the Supreme Court says, essentially, you have to view it without the 20/20 hindsight of a video camera or someone else watching from the scene, or someone else who would later say, well, why didn't you do this? You are forced to, in terms of court proceedings, view it from the perspective of an officer who knows that he has to make a split-second decision in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. So that gives the police, a necessarily wider range of reasonableness than we would normally apply when we can watch a situation occur a number of times and pick it apart and try to point out, well, we could have done this here or that there. And all of those are great learning points. We want to assess what's going on. But when we determine whether there's some sort of criminal action or civil liability, it has to be judged from that perspective that has no 20/20 hindsight.
So here's a question. How much training in these scenarios? Does someone study these scenarios and put these together as training exercises?
That has been a trend in law enforcement over the past probably about 10 years. That's become much more the paradigm than not. Okay. For a long time, there was no training like that. But as technology increases and our ability to replicate these scenarios safely in training, then that makes it much more likely that officers are going to obtain the type of training that they really need. Now, that said, really good training is by necessity very expensive. You have to have skilled, effective, and knowledgeable role players to do training. You have to have appropriate equipment, and most importantly, you have to have time. And that's usually where most of the time we fall down in law enforcement, is there is just insufficient time to train to the appropriate level that one would need. And most of the law enforcement officers that I know that are really, really competent. I mean, truly expert in use of force issues are people who take their own time to do that. There is just simply not enough time
sure
on the government's time to
Probably
make
not.
yourself expert.
Or the budget to
Right.
pay for the training.
Right.
So, as a martial artist, how long have you been a police officer?
I've been a police officer 20 years now.
20 years, and
Yeah.
you've been trained martial arts on and off your whole life.
That's correct. That's correct.
Well, I'm sure that you've probably put together, in your mind, maybe out on paper, I don't know, what you guys should be doing. Have you come up with the most
We,
cost-effective way to try to spread that around?
That's again, it's difficult because we put together what was at the Tulsa Police Department. We put together what was really an outstanding curriculum, a set of techniques that we teach. But that's really a very, very minor part of what makes you competent. When I first got on the police department, not only was the curriculum much less appropriative, it was so broad that there was no way anybody would develop any proficiency in it. One of the things that we did when we modified this curriculum is we cut it down significantly and tried to get fewer responses to cover a broader range of scenarios rather than having a technique for every potential scenario. Very, very difficult to do that kind of training. But that was one of the overall objectives when our new group came in and decided we wanted to modify the curriculum, was that we wanted to significantly reduce the number of techniques that we were teaching. In addition, the actual techniques that we teach are, again, a really, really small part of what makes someone competent in use of force issues. Because what really makes them competent is not only their ability to apply these, but their decision to apply them at a moment's notice. Most of the time, what we see when we see a law enforcement use of force situation gone bad, usually it's one of a couple of things. It's usually not enough force applied quickly enough, an inappropriate tool selected for that use of force, or an officer that is not confident, and that lack of confidence manifests itself by overusing force, underusing force, or picking inappropriate tools for force.
Well, I'm sure, like anybody, you guys ain't superhuman. You're bound to get scared every now and then.
Absolutely. I mean, there's police officers come from all the same places everybody else does.
You train for a cage fight for 6 months. You think you're ready, but then you're in the back room and you're like, "What am I doing?"
Wanting to throw up, can't drink water. Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
And
you have, and in addition to the preparation that you have for that, that fight is coming. The vast majority of times that police officers get in confrontations, that confrontation happens in a split second.
you never know when it's coming.
Right.
You never know when.
You have some, you may have some clues that something's about to happen, but you didn't have 6 months of preparation, the ability to videotape and study your opponent, and all those other things.
Well, 20 years is a pretty good chunk. So, what's gotten easier, and what's gotten harder?
Well, the job is infinitely easier in terms of decision making. I think anytime it's just like. Probably the most obvious example to people is learning to drive a car. When we first learn to drive a car, it's very difficult. We make every decision with the front lobe of our brain. Applying the brakes an appropriate amount. Thank you. Applying the brakes an appropriate amount. Not oversteering. All those things are very, very difficult. But 10 years later, you drive in your sleep for all intents and purposes.
Yes.
And the same sort of thing occurs in law enforcement and learn to be a police officer. The situations that we deal in have sometimes very, very different facts, but they generally fit into some pretty common categories. And we see most of the same reactions and behaviors and things like that. Those are all pretty common.
Some things are predictable. Some things.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So.
It does get easier as time goes on.
What's the hardest part about your job on a day-to-day basis?
Well, right now, I'm the supervisor of the Child Crisis Unit, which basically investigates crimes against children. So our cases are either child abuse, both physical and sexual, child neglect, and child death. So any child death that occurs in the city of Tulsa, we go and investigate it. And it's probably the hardest thing is having to having to deal with a child victim who's played no role in their victimization. With a lot of other crimes, the victims sometimes play some role in what's happened to them, but that's just not the case with kids. Kids play no role in their victimization.
Man, and you're a father too.
That's correct, yeah.
Is this something you see yourself doing long-term on the police department, or something that's best to do for a few years and get?
The vast majority of people in that job do it for not much longer than 5 to 7 years.
Okay.
It's we have one officer in my unit that's done it for 15 years.
Really?
And he's absolutely outstanding. He is a nationally recognized expert in child death mortality, and will probably continue to do it until he retires. But he is a rare exception. He is not the norm.
That would be hard. I think that would be hard for me. I don't know if I could handle being around.
It is definitely not for everybody. When we interview a new officer, one of the who's seeking to come into the unit, one of the questions typically asked is, the vast majority of police officers, when they talk about our unit, say, "Man, I couldn't do that." And so we have to understand why this particular officer is different. Why can they handle it when so many others can't?
I think the hardest thing would be not putting my hands on an adult when I knew they did something like that. That would show great restraint that I might not be capable of.
It does take great restraint, but what we have to keep in mind is that, if we go and do something like that, while it could be in the short term very satisfying, if we don't maintain our cool, no one gets justice for those kids, and that's really what we're there for.
There's a lot of stuff going on. Here's a question I've always wanted to know. How much violence should everyday people have control of in their lives versus this is the line you don't go over, this is the cop's job? How far should everyday people be allowed to handle certain things in life before they decide, hey, now I need...
Well, I'm a big believer in self-determination, so I don't think that... I think that the in terms of our everyday responsibilities, the police largely don't prevent much crime. We investigate crime.
Yeah, you're usually called after the fact.
Yeah, we come unfortunately, after stuff has already happened. We would love to be there before it happens. I mean, there's nothing that any police officer wants more than to be able to prevent something from happening. It's just not very realistic. The way we prevent crime is by finding the people that have already done something and prevent them from victimizing a number of other people down the line, or prevent future victimization on the same victim. So, by and large, I'm a big believer in people being both willing and able to handle those situations themselves, simply from a practical standpoint. You cannot expect that if you call 911 because someone's breaking into your house, that police officer will get there before it happens. It's just not realistic. And I am a firm supporter in the idea that individuals should be able to protect themselves.
This is something I think needs to be a conversation. I'm a firm believer in our right to bear arms. I grew up in a family where I was taken to the range. Many times over my life I was taught how to shoot. We have guns that's been handed down generation to generation. But I find it weird that in a country that has firearms so interwoven into our society that we don't do a better job of teaching people how to use them. There's no safety, and I'm not even saying give kids... And I'm not even talking about kids. I'm talking 17, 18-year-olds in high school. airsoft rifles, at least learn this is how you take one apart, put together, this is how you shoot, these are the basics. There's no real bullet, no one's going to get killed, but it just makes no sense that in a society as big as we have, you can go buy a
As
gun.
many resources as we have.
Yeah, you don't even know how to use the thing, you know. Most people like me that grew up, no problem. We grew up around them our whole life. But what about, you know, what do we do? How do we protect our right to bear arms, but still protect ourselves?
You know, it's interesting because I did not grow up in a family that was interested in firearms. I never had a gun until I became a police officer.
Really?
Yeah, I had never had.
See, that's strange to me. You know?
Yeah, it's you know, I was an urbanite. You know, I didn't have any experience hunting. You know, it was all a brand new experience to me. Where I think, and I've since obviously had a you know, bit of a transformation as far as that goes. But I think where the situation tends to go wrong for us in this country is that we kind of view our rights and neglect our responsibilities.
There's a good point right
You
there.
know, we don't ever, you know, every right that we have
There's a responsibility.
comes along with a commensurate responsibility. And we are very, very quick to assert our rights, but very, very neglect in our responsibilities.
Yes.
And I think that I am a firm believer in the Second Amendment. I believe it is inalienable. I think that a human's right, to self-determination, self-protection, is the one that assures all the rest.
Yes.
And so we can't do that. That said, that same right bears a tremendous responsibility. I mean, if you think about it for a
You
moment.
carry the power of death around on your hip.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, in the United States, or in the state of Oklahoma, we have the right to defend ourselves with deadly force, and a court and society will hold you blameless if they decide the circumstances are right.
Yes. There
There is not a court in our country that has that same power. If you think about it, an individual in a split second can decide the life or death of another person and be held blameless if the circumstances are correct. Any court that gets to decide whether someone lives or dies, they can't execute summary judgment on that. They can't, do an instant execution. Those things go through years and years and years of appeals. So if you think about it, that power that you have, in being able to possess a gun is a power higher than any court in this country has.
Hey, man, let's switch gears here and loosen it up, and let's go to jiu-jitsu mode.
One of my favorite topics.
Let's talk about how your journey in jiu-jitsu started.
Well, I started in college shortly after I was done with football and looking for something else to do. And I found, got much more interested in martial arts again, and had found that in addition, I'd wrestled in high school and briefly in college, and found that all of a sudden grappling style martial arts were becoming a little bit more popular. This was pre UFC 1. Okay. And I, like probably almost everybody else who got into jiu-jitsu around that time, saw UFC 1 and said, I got to do that.
Yep, I was the same way, man. I was like, who is this guy?
Yep. I got to learn this.
Yep, I was blown away.
Yeah.
I'd wrestled in school too, and I couldn't believe it. It's like, why didn't they teach us that?
Yeah, I just I saw it, and I like I said, like everybody else, just said, man, I got to learn this, and started out watching videotapes and working with other people, and eventually found a real source for it.
So where was the first school you went to?
The very first school I went to was in New York. I trained with former UFC fighter named Matt Serra.
Oh, you trained with Matt Serra.
Yeah, very, very briefly. I was working in New York City as an intern, and would go there when I could and learned, some very, very basic stuff. And then graduated college and came to Tulsa. And there wasn't any formal jiu-jitsu because this is 1995. There were no real jiu-jitsu classes. There was no school that taught Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And so I started getting into the Inosanto blend, Muay Thai and Kali and Jun Fan, and trained at Terry Gibson School.
Okay.
And Reichler, where Christian also got a
Yes.
got a start. And but they did have a form of grappling that they used. It was not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I believe they referred to it back then as shoot fighting.
Shoot
sort
fighting.
of Japanese, some sort of Japanese hybrid submission art.
Yeah. It was actually off of their, if you look into it, it came off their pro wrestling.
Right.
Because they had
yes,
shoots and
yes,
works over there, so they
exactly,
still had, they were
exactly.
still fighting.
Right. Exactly. The term, where the term shoot fighting comes from.
Yes.
So began doing that. And at some point, I realized I just had to, I had to get a much more direct source for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And just as fate would have it, I ran into a guy who was a pilot for, I believe, United Airlines, who also happened to be a purple belt at that time under Rafael Lovato.
Stumbling into a purple belt at that time was probably pretty rough.
Was pretty unusual. And this was, I want to say this was 2001, so we'd been about 6 years
Okay.
from when I'd started. And yeah, again, like you say, purple belt, pretty rare.
Yeah.
There was hardly any, there was not a real, full jiu-jitsu school in Tulsa at that time. And ran into him, and we didn't meet via martial arts. We met because I was teaching firearms in the private sector at the time, and 9/11 had just happened, and they were preparing pilots to be armed, doing the flight deck officer program.
Okay.
And he wanted some training in shooting, and we got to talking, and eventually we got to the point where we decided to trade shooting lessons for jiu-jitsu lessons.
Awesome.
And so I had a private jiu-jitsu coach for pretty extended period of time. And then, I trained with him for a couple of years, and eventually he had gone back into the military and had deployed, so he was gone, and so I was left without instructor. But he had been training under Rafael Lovato Sr. So I would travel, once a month, a couple times a month to Oklahoma City to train with Rafael Lovato Sr. and try to bring what I could back and train with a group of friends here.
So you had some friends you were rolling with back home?
Right. Some friends I would train with here. And then eventually found that Mikey Burnett was opening a new school called Oklahoma Fight Club, and decided to join there.
Oh, awesome. So you trained with Mikey for a while.
I did. I trained with Mikey for years.
What's Mikey like, man? I hear all kinds of stories.
Mikey was, quite honestly, man, was one of the best human beings that I know. He was, was a great grappler. Very, very kind and giving person. But like a lot of people like that, like people who are kind of genius in an area. He was also very, very scatterbrained, and was so a lot of times the instruction wasn't very organized, which brought us to where I got to see my next instructor, because we were having some difficulty, trying to do that. We needed an organization to be under. I had an association with a friend of mine named Cecil Birch, who was a black belt under Megaton Diaz. Who's Megaton Diaz is I'm sure you're familiar with Mackenzie Dern.
Yes.
He's Mackenzie's father.
Okay.
So he's the only person to ever compete in every Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu World Championships at black belt.
Wow.
So he's a stud.
Dang. Yeah,
You know,
sounds
one of
like
the,
it.
a legend and legend of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And we would bring Cecil, one of his coaches, 4 or 5 times a year to Tulsa from Phoenix, and he would work with us and give us things to work on and
Now,
things
were
to
you-
train in.
Were you belted at this time?
This time, yes, I was by the time I think probably within the first couple times that we trained with Cecil. Of course, that's over a period of time.
Okay.
I was promoted to blue belt.
Okay, so you're a blue belt.
Yeah,
at
I was
this
a blue
time.
belt by then.
Okay.
And then this eventually went on for a period of let's see, from 2005 until 2012.
Now, from this time when you're in Oklahoma up till blue belt, you're working as a police officer too.
That's correct.
Had you used your jujitsu? Had any had this been used and saved or?
Oh yeah. I mean the jujitsu that that I was learning, I had today. I think we kind of people who learn jiu-jitsu today kind of forget where jiu-jitsu was originally from.
Yes.
Jiu-jitsu is a fighting art first and foremost.
Yes.
We kind of forget that in the midst of competition jiu-jitsu and jiu-jitsu for fitness and all kinds of other things. But jiu-jitsu is about fighting first and foremost.
That's true, but some of us are just born grapplers,
Right,
and some of we
right,
have to take some
absolutely.
blame for dragging it away from the fight. But
Yeah.
we started,
So-
Christian started me out right. I had a couple cage fights starting
Yeah.
out, so I learned
Yeah.
what it was first before he let
Right.
me start playing with rubber guard and all that silly
Yeah.
stuff.
So I'd learned it for that purpose. And at the very beginning of this, we discussed the idea of finding a martial art appropriate to policing. And while I do believe that there isn't a perfect martial art for policing, if there is one, jiu-jitsu is pretty close to it. For the primary reason that when we take somebody into custody, if they're going to struggle, if they're going to fight, whether they're just resisting or whether they're actually being combative, the most effective way to put handcuffs on them and cease them from doing that is to put them on the ground. It's very, very difficult to handcuff somebody struggling who's standing, when they're mobile. So the
think
most
it's-
effective way to do it is to put them on the ground and stop them. That immediately you stop their locomotion right there, and then eventually you're able to secure them.
Now, when done right, I would agree. I would have to say that if you're going to control a human being, it's easier to control them on the ground,
Right.
not just for your safety, but for theirs too.
Absolutely.
When there's
Absolutely.
things you can do, and there's things people have seen done with people on the ground. But for the most part, when I see stuff, you guys do a pretty good job of.
I appreciate it. Yeah, when it's like I said, when it's done appropriately, the ground is the safest way. Like I said, both for the officers and for the suspect. It's because it's just simply too difficult to secure someone standing. They have too much mobility.
Yes.
When you put them on the ground, at the very least, their mobility is reduced. It's not eliminated, but it's greatly reduced. And there are, again, like I said, jiu-jitsu isn't perfect for that, but it's pretty darn good. It's pretty close. And the ability to to hold someone in a position, or the ability to apply a hold that that encourages their compliance, is all right up a police officer's alley.
There's a personal question with this I want to ask. Is it the training itself? Okay, when you go, some cops go to seminars and they learn a few things and they train a couple weeks and then that's it.
Right.
There's one thing to learn a technique and do it. It's another thing. What helps you more, those techniques or just the experience of rolling and sparring and grappling?
Yeah, was one of the what we discussed earlier, the idea of reducing the number of techniques that we taught when we developed a new curriculum, when new instructors kind of came into the police department. That was another very, very important factor that we wanted everybody to experience, was the idea of being forced to fight, and know that most of the time that if both people are unarmed, you'll probably be okay. If there are a few things that you do, to mitigate the aggressiveness of the other person, their ability to strike you, things like that, you'll probably be all right. You won't necessarily dominate a fight, like we envision in a martial arts movie or things like that. But you can do a pretty good job preventing yourself from getting hurt. And that familiarity with that discomfort that you get in jiu-jitsu is so important in that kind of scenario. There's a great deal of research into police use of force, and heart rates, and when heart rates rise, decision making goes down.
Yes.
And if you have somebody who's fairly inexperienced in fighting, then their heart rate spikes right away once the fight starts.
They're gone.
They're past that point of making good decisions. Well, for your much more trained officer, an officer who's familiar with fighting, who knows that if I get punched in the face, I'll probably be okay. If I'm down on the ground in an uncomfortable position, I know how to get out of it. I'll be all right, and I'll control this person. Then, their heart rate, doesn't rise much above when they're jogging, and they can still make good decisions. That's where I think something like jiu-jitsu and the experience of competing against another live will is critical. Where it is, like I said, is incomparable to with other martial arts.
It seems like people who face adversity on a day-to-day basis make better decisions in adversity.
Right. I think that's one of our our fundamental things that jiu-jitsu gives you is the opportunity to face something difficult. Because
Yes.
in our country right now, most of us can go all our lives without having any idea whether or not we're a coward.
Right. That's true.
We don't have to fight. There's no draft. You're not forced to compete in a sport that involves contact. Very, very, you could conceivably go your whole life without confronting anybody more aggressive than a telemarketer.
Does that scare you a little bit?
Oh, it's
It terrifies me because we
Yeah.
live in a republic based
Yeah.
on free speech, and if people,
yeah.
if they don't know, they don't stand up, and if they don't stand up, a republic don't work.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that most of our individuals who have understood the need to stand up in society have had some experience in combat athletics.
I think people need to learn.
know.
I think jiu-jitsu should be
It's
at
very-
school. People think I'm crazy, but I think it should be there.
It would be it's a logical choice because I think that besides the intimacy of the contact, that can make a lot of people uncomfortable, it's otherwise okay, and it's pretty harmless in a lot of ways. It's not you can take a very, very athletic child and they can do it, but an unathletic child's probably going to get pretty darn good too with the appropriate amount
Yes,
of
with the
appropriate amount of
technique.
coaching.
I think that, like from kindergarten to
It's
a
not
certain
like
age-
basketball, because basketball
Right.
you'll have your exceptions, your Spud Webbs, people like that who are 5'6" and can play in the NBA. But by and large, if you're a person looking to play in the NBA, if you're not 6'5" or taller, you're never going to play.
Most
But in
sports
jiu-jitsu,
favor, yes.
you can be fairly unathletic, and if you put enough effort into it, you can probably be at that, essentially NBA equivalent.
Yeah.
It
It's
doesn't
amazing.
take. Certainly being athletic helps you, but it's definitely an area that that can assist. I mean, it's one of the reasons I have both my daughters in jiu-jitsu, is because regardless of your level of athleticism, if you pay close enough attention and you participate enough, you'll get better at this.
Yes.
And you'll probably get to the point of being very good.
Yes. Everybody that I've seen that trains, they just get good.
All right.
Now, are some of those people better than some of the others? Well, that's just human nature. Some of us have a adaptability, but
Yeah, some
know.
will always accelerate more than others, and
Yes.
faster than others.
But can you imagine being a bully? You're going to go pick on the guy that's the weak guy in class, but he's got 5 buddies standing there that all know jujitsu too. It changes the outscope a little bit, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that it's a difficult question because then we ask ourselves, are we potentially arming people who, would not be, good candidates for jiu-jitsu? Because that's certainly happened in jiu-jitsu.
But the whole society's armed to fight against that one
right.
problem.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, I think that if I were to lean towards one side or the other, I would lean towards everybody having it as opposed to not.
Same thing as guns, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's, but that's where, that's kind of where the question lies: is do we, is it?
Well, let me ask you this:
we'll always have difficulty with it because there are people who will not believe in it.
Quick cop decision. Mm-hmm. Would you feel safer? Let's say there's a Walmart shooting. You're in there trying to find the bad guy. Mm-hmm. There's civilians in there with guns.
Right.
You can't weed them out, but they're in there. Mm-hmm. Would you feel more comfortable with martial artists with guns on their hip, or everyday Joe you ain't got no clue about?
I think that's probably too broad an assessment to really say, because here's another thing to consider, is that when people are taught martial arts, by and large, martial arts are categorized by their series of techniques. And some of those techniques are immediately more effective than others. Some are more effective because of training method. For instance, the difference there's really not much difference in how you punch in martial arts systems.
Right.
But there's a reason that boxing tends to be more effective than, say, Shotokan karate.
Sparring.
By and large. And that's it's the training method. The training method they use. The appreciation they have for physical conditioning, all kinds of other things. So that's a big question.
So it's a jiu-jitsu guys, would that narrow it down?
Well, in addition to that, then we drag ourselves even further, because we say, let's assume we've trained jiu-jitsu. I still have friends who are really good in jiu-jitsu who say, man, I would be terrified to do that.
Oh, really?
And
I
think
always
that's
assume that somebody under adversity would make better decisions in
Right.
that situation than. And if you know how to fight, you're less likely to pull the gun unless you have to.
I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
Could be wrong in some cases,
Yeah,
but I think
think that that by and large, even if you look at a population of martial artists, amidst those martial artists, just like when we look at a population of police officers, there are a certain percentage of police officers that I look at and say, you're probably best suited for the non-physical aspect of this job.
Okay, I get what you're saying.
And I think that the same applies to martial artists. Now, is that person who was less suited for that much better off with jiu-jitsu than not?
Yes.
Oh, yes. No question about that. They are. So I think probably a better comparison would be, a better way to say it would be, if you were to take, if I was to walk into a Walmart and feel comfortable with someone with a gun, would I feel more comfortable if that same person had some training in adverse situations than not?
Yes.
Absolutely.
I just think it's
Absolutely.
crazy that in a country where we can defend ourselves, we can kill if needed, we don't know how to fight, and we don't know how to shoot.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's if you're honest about the problem, if you're honest about the problem of self-defense, then simply just buying a gun isn't the solution.
No, you got to go learn how to use it.
Yeah.
I would suggest
train
learn
your
how
mind to use
how to
it.
fight first, though.
Yeah.
I would
Right.
learn how to fight. That way,
Right.
you're not going to pull it because you're scared.
Well, and quite simply, your body's always with you.
Yes, your body's always there. If you get disarmed in a situation, you're still in the fight.
It's a similar problem that we have in policing. Policing, we do a very, very good job of moving towards hardware solutions, but we don't do much to develop our software. One of the original fathers of police defensive tactics, a gentleman named Robert Koga, who was a Los Angeles police officer, developed a system called the Koga system of self-defense. His system was very, very, very complex, but he made a very, very good point in relating to police self-defense, and that's that police officers have to learn to use their bodies before they start to rely on things like batons.
That's what I'm saying.
And I think that's critical. And I think that we have, instead of training our police officers to use their bodies well, we have gone to, well, let's create a taser. Let's create a, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with a taser.
Human nature is to find ways to make life easier for ourselves.
Right.
And I think that's another reason why martial arts is so important. We should integrate it into our society to protect ourselves from making life too easy.
Right. Training the mind is a far bigger deal than simply giving a person a tool.
Yes.
And I think that if there is a serious benefit to a combative sport, or combative martial art like jiu-jitsu, then it's that, it teaches you to be okay, to be able to think in adverse situations, to not immediately panic and, realize that your life's not going down the toilet. You'll be okay.
Okay.
That you're, when you've got somebody's mounted you and you're having trouble breathing, and that just, go back to center, get back to your breathing, recognize that you know what to do, and you'll be okay.
Yeah.
But if you, how it is when somebody, a white belt, first walks in, the first thing that happens when they're on the bottom is, you hear that.
Or they hold their breath.
Yeah, or hold their breath.
They hold their breath.
And you say, and whatever you do, don't do that.
Yep.
That's the one thing you can't do.
Try
is
to
you
calm
can't
down.
freak out.
I make them close their eyes. It seems to be when they close their eyes, I say, all right, I got my hands on you, and I'm not going to hurt you. Close your eyes. And they will grapple so much better with their eyes closed than they will with their eyes open.
Yeah, so they become much more kinesthetic at that point.
Yes. They start to feel their way. And to me, jiu-jitsu and grappling for my way is
all
about
about feel.
the feel and,
Yeah.
and really homing in on what you're.
Yeah. The idea of closing your eyes, in my opinion, is not an exclusive concept for beginners. It's one that I use very regularly.
Yes, it helps my breathing. I control my breathing better when my eyes are closed.
Yeah, I know. I find that I get myself, like I said, I center myself a lot better when I close my eyes.
How we doing for time, Rod? 1 hour. All righty. So, anything else before we wrap it up?
So, well, it's up to you, Mike. You can tell I love to talk. So
Man, I do too. I love to talk. We'll keep talking till Rodney kicks us out of here, man. We need to wrap up, brother. It's up to you. All right, man. I tell you what, we'll bring you on again.
okay, sounds good.
I tell you, one of the most. I told someone the other day, I said, when I met Mike and you came to the gym and you coached a class for me when my knee was hurt and we talked, I said, he's one of the most interesting guys I know. And then I met your little girl the other day, and she might be the most interesting human being that I've ever met.
She is nothing if not interesting.
I can't wait to see her grow up and see where life takes her, man.
I'll tell you, it scares me, but it'll be interesting if nothing else.
Well, man, I really appreciate you coming on here and talking with us.
Thank you. Glad to do it.
Thank you. And thank you guys for listening to us. We're going to put a number on the bottom of the screen later for anybody who's looking to advertise. So if you want to advertise in the martial arts community, I think Matt Chat is the place for you. I'm Mike McGonigal, and we'll catch you later, man.